That's a bad story about dancing, isn't it? As a weapon. I'm going to share with you, I'm going to go to the Old Testament, to 2 Samuel, chapter 6. I'm actually, this is what the lectionary says to read, but later on I'm going to help you with this story by starting at verse 1. But right now I'm going to start with what they got here. This might be a familiar story to many. It was told to King David, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God. The ark of God was in Obed-Edom's house. Okay. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. And when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, David sacrificed an ox and a fatling. David danced before the Lord with all his might. David was girded with a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the trumpet. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. Well, they brought the ark of the Lord. They brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and offerings of well-being before the Lord. When David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the offerings of well-being, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts and distributed food among all the people. And the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, to each a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins. Then all the people went back to their homes. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Amen. Okay. Well, here it is. We're in the middle of summer. All right, with all of its fairs and flags and celebrations and fireworks and visitations, vacations. And we're going to take a few weeks. That's right, Jerry. Weeks, all right? And we're going to focus on worship, because I think we come to worship, and worship has a variety of portions to it, whether you know it or not. And we're going to focus on worship. We're going to focus on what it is we do. And I think why should we worship? You know, all of this, those are all good questions. But what I want to start with in discussing worship as a whole is David. I think that there's something dynamic about David, King David, if you will. Something compelling, yet something disturbing about the life that he leads and the choices that he makes. Because when we go through this story of David, you can't help but wonder why David's considered a man after God's own heart. It certainly wasn't because David was perfect or always did things the right way, God's way, no. So how do we understand a description like a person after God's own heart? How do we see that in David? And then following David is his son Solomon. How does it work out for him? How does he carry on King David's legacy? We'll look at all of this over the next few weeks. Because I think there's many attributes and inclinations that might help us understand what it means to be a person after God's heart. And in this sermon series, I want to invite you to consider that for David, worship was life. Did you hear me? For David, worship was life. Worship wasn't something David did. It wasn't a specific time of day for him every day. Okay, well, I got to go worship. It wasn't a specific day of a week with a time in it. Hey, it's 10:30, I got to be in church. Worship for David was who he was. It was his very character. David lived and breathed worship. And sure, sometimes he got it wrong, wildly, badly wrong. Sometimes he followed impulses that led him astray. And sometimes he got confused about who was the object of this worship. And that got in the way of being with the God that he loved. But through it all, David lived as though his life was an offering to God. Now, I'm going to go one step further in this worship series. I'm going to say that life is worship. Even our lives are worship. I want us as a body of believers to take time to walk together through the order of worship that we do each Sunday. And in doing so, find insight into how our lives are shaped and bounded by inclination and the calling to worship. I believe this is important because I feel that we find ourselves seeking after God's heart as we worship and as we live in our day-to-day. And in so doing, in learning this, I hope that we learn to live wholeheartedly, putting our whole selves into how we live. And that we'll find our way back to worship each week with rejoicing. Now back to King David. When we think how King David, we may think we actually know King David. Everyone heard a story or two about him. This is a giant slayer, all right? Everyone got the little rock, the little boy, shepherd boy with the rock, okay, the slingshot, took down the big giant guy. Okay, that's David. All right, so we heard some of that. We've heard about his highlights. I'd say that was a highlight. When maybe we skipped over or heard about some of his lows too. So I don't know that we really know what's going on with King David. But here in our story today, King David wants to bring the ark of God back to Jerusalem. All right, the ark. Maybe it was to honor God that he wanted to do it, to bring God home to a place where God is known and worshiped. Now that would have been hard because the ark was never in Jerusalem to start with. When Joshua came across, all right, into the land that had been promised the Israelites, and they started taking it over, their invasion came in, and they started displacing, killing off all the peoples that were in there. They came to Jerusalem, which was a fortified city held by the Jebusites, and they couldn't take it. All right? Because the further they went, the less people they had, because people started building their houses and living where they were. So they got around there, they couldn't do it. So Joshua said, we'll just leave it. And they did. Until King David puts together his army. And then he takes the city. He says, this is where we're going to start. This hard to take place, something Joshua couldn't even do, is going to be the centerpiece of our new kingdom. David loved the Lord. He was known to write songs expressing that love, many of which are favorites of ours today. I know you guys probably know Psalm 23, the 23rd Psalm, the Lord is my shepherd, right? Everyone heard that one at least once? If you've been to any funerals, you always hear that one. Probably more familiar with it than Psalm 24, which we said today, and they're right beside each other in my Bible. Yeah. But we might not know all about it. But we do think in moving the Ark of God back to Jerusalem, David wanted God nearby. He wanted the manifestation of God's abiding presence among God's people and near him. A man after God's own heart. Now, some would argue that David had real personal motives behind this decision, because the city itself wasn't even called the city of David yet. It's still called Jerusalem after the people who lived there. The new king, maybe the people were saying the new king needs something to establish his power, to make his mark on this city and these people. So I'll admit, maybe a little selfishness drove David to seek out this relic, this religious symbol, and bring it back home. I don't know. We can be sure either way what his motives were. Most likely it was a little of both. Whenever I think about what motives David had in bringing that, I always think about what motivates us to worship even today, to come to worship. How pure are our motives? If we're looking for pure motives, how pure are our motives? I mean, it'd be easy to be critical of kings like David And indeed, our expectation of them as leaders is real high. But mixed motives, selfishness, laziness, desire to please someone other than God, they're often behind our choices to gather for worship. Pretty much almost any time that we come here. But of course we want to honor God. Of course we love to be in the house of the Lord. Of course, but what about when something goes wrong? What happens when something goes wrong? Just regular things. What happens when my microphone goes dead? Does that ever happen? Happens every month. It happens every month. Normally, right before the sermon, Jade times it. No, you don't. It just happens. I know. Thank you, Jade. What about when Jade's car gets a flat tire on the way here from the other church? Yeah, that kind of throws a wrench into things. That's happened too. Or the altar flowers are the wrong season. Oh my goodness, that gets me. All right. Someone made a mistake in the bulletin. No fingers. Don't point any fingers. Yeah, when one of the candles goes out. I hope that's the New Testament. This is the Old Testament. Some people say that's what the candles mean. But since I was reading the Old Testament, they blew out the new one this week. No, that's not what it meant. There's some wax problem in it. You can fix it if you don't like it. Sometimes all of these things just make you feel like, hey, I'm going to pack it in and go home. But what do we do then? When the world around us gets to us, do we give up? Do we? David did. David did. This is the end of a story. This is the end of the story. David had given up before this. All right? Let me share how it works out. All right? Because this is a tad bit more serious than a dead microphone occurring during the reading. So this is me telling you about chapter 2, chapter 6 in 2 Samuel. It really starts off with David putting together about 30 divisions of troops. And he takes all these soldiers over to the Philistine city and levels it to get the ark of the Lord. Okay. So that city's name was Bala. David recovers the chest of God. All right. And this is because God's presence was supposed to be manifested in between the two angels on the top ornament. Inside of the chest was the what they called the Ark of the New Covenant. All right, the Ark of the Covenant, because it has Moses' tablets in there. All right, it also has this staff that Aaron held that budded. Do you remember that? And it has a jar with manna in it. That was God's gift to the people, so they'd survive 40 years in the desert. But the presence of God was supposed to hover above this chest. So they take the chest and they place it on a brand new ox cart. They move it from where it was. All right, it was on a hilltop in a house owned by Abin-Adad. I'm going to get it right one time. And so the people that are going to do this were priests. Okay, so you have Uzzah and his brother Ahio. It's almost Ohio, but with an A. All right? These are Abinadab's sons. They were driving the new ox cart loaded with the chest of God back into Israel from this Palestinian city. Now, Abinadab was not a Palestinian. He was a Jew. The Palestinians didn't know what to do with this thing, so they brought in Jews as prisoners to be the priest over this so that they wouldn't be cursed. And that's what happened. David and the whole company of Israel were in the parade, singing at the top of their lungs, playing all kinds of instruments, mandolins, harps, tambourines, castanets, cymbals, blowing trumpets. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, the oxen stumbled, pulling the cart. The cart starts to tilt. The ark was about to fall out of the cart, and Uzzah puts his hands up to stop it. It's a bad situation getting worse, right? This angers God. That Uzzah would feel that he was clean enough to touch the ark of his presence. So God strikes him dead on the spot, right there beside the chest, beside the ox cart. That kind of ruins the party. David gets angry because of God's deadly outburst against Uzzah. And that place was named after Uzzah from there on. David became fearful of what God would do if something else happened, and he says, this chest is too dangerous to handle. How can I ever get it back to my city? And he just refused to take the chest of God any further. There was a house nearby, owned by Obed-Edom. You guys know how it sounds like a country song. Obed-Edom, Obed-Edom, Obed-Edom. But that was the guy's name. That's how you know it is. I just keep thinking that song, Jay. Sorry about that. No? Okay. And the chest stays there for 3 months. 3 months. And it doesn't come back up into play until one day David hears about how good things have turned out for Obed-Edom and his family. God has been blessing them. And then it turns up. The incident with Uzzah, on the way back, trying to do what's right, and an impulse, being struck dead, worship stopper. All right, let's just agree. Anyone think that that's not a worship stopper? It is. All right, it is. It's a story too painful, too unfair, too unjust to tell sometimes. And it seems so very unlike God, at least the God that we know from Jesus' example among us. It seems so unlikely, so unfair, just not right. It's definitely a story that's not easy to explain. It can derail a comfortable Sunday worship experience, that's for sure. That's for sure. Let me share a story with you. This is not that old a story. You might be familiar with it. In a small town that's just right outside of a big city, there was an Uzzah-like moment. Okay. A police officer was off duty, was driving, when he saw a car crash through a barrier. Car flies across the street and into the front porch of the house, ends up landing on its side with its wheels still spinning, oil's coming out of it. Immediately, the officer stops his car, leaps into action, went to see if the driver and the passenger were all right, get him out from it. When he leans in to the open window to ask if they need any help, the driver pulls a gun and shoots him 12 times. Anyone know this story? This isn't a story from far away. This story happened in Indianapolis, Indiana. Okay, right outside of Indianapolis. Officer, Police Lieutenant Aaron Allen was only trying to help, to keep disaster from becoming even worse. How fair is that? How fair is that? How is that just? When we gather for worship after incidents like that, no one ever comes up to me and says, hey, Tim, can you explain the goodness of God to us before we worship? If this is happening, if this kind of thing happens, where's God's goodness in letting things like this happen? No one has to ask. I feel the question burning in the wounded souls after that happens. I mean, I ask it myself, where is God's goodness in this? And what am I to do? Because to be honest, I wouldn't know the answer if you actually asked me, if you just stood up in the middle of worship and asked. I don't know. So I can understand David putting the ark at Obed-Edom's house and walking away for 3 months. Sometimes you need a little time and distance. And I understand why the people that wrote our lectionary, the common lectionary, tells us what scriptures we should do every week. They said start at verse 12, don't go back to verse 1. It's hard. It's a hard reality to deal with. But here's what happens. David does come back in verse 12. He does. He does. And the parade starts again. This is how the parade goes. You know, he gets his little parade baton thing. He's got the flag. Sort of like Josie had the flag for the band at the Lions Club parade. Stephanie's daughter carried the school flag. Raise it up, and they go, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and he puts it down. He says, stop everything. Let's have worship. And I'll tell you, it's not just like 20 steps to get to Jerusalem from Obed-Edom's house. They were stopping every 6 feet and worshiping. And I'm talking full-on worship. It wasn't a quick communion. They cut a cow and burned it, all right? They were fully worshiping God every 6 steps. Making sure we're going to, David, I think maybe it was one of the, let's take it slow and easy this time. Let's take it slow and easy. Let's worship every chance we get this God. We don't want any mistakes. Let's do the best we can. Let's show God we love Him each and every step. So the parade starts again. And David always stops at every 6 steps and throws in an act of worship. An act of worship. Such a tragic event had occurred. An act of worship. So friends, I think that when there aren't any explanations, worship is the best response. It just is. You'd be wondering why. Just worship. David went on. He brings the ark. He brought God back home, and he dances all the way. All right? He strips down to his t-shirt and shorts, and in his grief and in his joy, he danced. All right? And they're mixed motives aside. We don't care why he's doing it. He dances. He's worshiping. He wholeheartedly is into it. And it's catching. It's catching on. He danced. Now, sometimes he did dance alone. I'll give you that. Other times, the whole city dances with him. And they participated in the sacrifice and in the feast that followed. Everyone did. No one went home with an empty stomach. They felt fulfilled and full. They rejoiced. They shouted his name, no doubt thanking David and God, crowning David, claiming him and God for their own. The God who had inspired David, they're praising. Now, did they all look beyond the sight of their king, stripped down to his whitey tighties and dancing and see the Spirit of God dancing right alongside of him? No, they didn't. Probably not. I can't prove it. I think it's like, I think of it like this. We each get up every day. All right? You guys. This is real people. You guys. All right? Get up each day. And maybe, like me, you pray to God for a great day. Then you go about doing and saying your everyday stuff. Just being you. And sometimes other people glimpse God in you and around you by the way you act or the things you say. But sometimes they don't. Well, I say, we just keep on dancing. Keep on dancing anyway, whether they see it or not. Keep pointing to the one who's playing the music that you hear. Those around you will appreciate it and maybe after a time join in dancing with you. But you got to be saying, hey, Pastor Tim, what about those who don't gather around, those who ain't going to get in step and dance, who don't feel the rhythm, the love of God? Because there are those on the sidelines who keep to themselves, those who stand apart and above and don't like what they see. David's wife, Michal, all right, didn't gather with him, didn't worship that day. She stood apart. She looked out. She was up high. She looked down on her husband, the king. Looked down on him. And our Bibles say she despised him in her heart. All right, she despised him. It's a Maury Povich show all over right here. If you need to read about it, it goes on. It's right after the part I read. They have a discussion. All right? All right? David has a little one-on-one time with Michael about this in the royal suite. But that doesn't change the truth of it. There are those who won't gather for worship for lots of reasons. And there are those who come to even hate worship. And they hate that we do worship. They think it's unseemly, it's shameless in our modern era to carry on in such a fashion. Maybe they're saying, surely we've progressed beyond this worship of an unseen God. Well, what could we do? We could hate him in return, but that wouldn't be Jesus, would it? Wouldn't be Christ-like. We'd call him names, point fingers. Maybe we could throw a warning at him. You better get right or you're going to go somewhere. Or maybe we could just keep dancing. Maybe we could just keep worshiping God. Maybe we could just keep showing our love of God through our daily lives and what we say. We could keep inviting. Keep extending our hand even to those who refuse to gather. But regardless, just keep dancing. Dance that worship into your lives. We can keep gathering, even with mixed motives. Well, I don't feel like it, but I'm going. But once you get here, you just start dancing. I don't care how you get here. Get on in and we'll dance. Whether you have a complete story or an incomplete story, whether you have a lack of answers or you got all the explanations, come on in. All are welcome, and we're going to dance. We're going to worship here. Thanks be to God, we can keep dancing, even